The story of Heloísa Borba Gonçalves is more than just a tale of crimes of passion or occasional greed. It's a case study in calculated manipulation on a scale that shocked Brazil and eventually landed the lawyer on Interpol's International Wanted List. Heloísa, known by the nickname Black Widow, was a methodical predator who targeted older, wealthy men, ensnaring them in brief marriages whose only certain outcome was the inheritance of their estates. Her trail of 4 murders and 2 attempted homicides stretched over more than 2 decades from 1971 to 1993, leaving behind a path of fraud, bigamy, and grief that echoed from the southern plains of Rio Grande do Sul to the beaches of Rio de Janeiro. For an American audience perhaps unfamiliar with the nuances of Brazil's geography or society in the latter half of the 20th century, understanding the rise of this criminal figure requires some context. Brazil in the 1970s and 1980s was still under the grip of a military dictatorship and authoritarian regime that lasted from 1964 to 1985. Although it maintained tight control over politics, it often allowed crimes of a social or financial nature, particularly those involving the upper classes, to dissolve into bureaucratic limbo or be quietly buried by social privilege. It was the perfect backdrop for someone who thrived in the shadows of status and wealth. Heloísa took advantage of flaws in Brazil's civil registry system and the common tendency to assume accidents or robberies in a country where urban violence was, and still is, a constant reality. Heloísa Borba Gonçalves was born on March 13, 1950, in the city of Porto Alegre, the capital of Rio Grande do Sul, at the southernmost tip of Brazil. Far from the tropical beaches of the northeast, Rio Grande do Sul is a region shaped by strong European influences, mainly Italian and German, known for its cold climate, its gaucho culture akin to the American cowboy tradition. Though centered on cattle ranching across the vast southern plains known as the Pampas, and a deeply rooted sense of social traditionalism, little is known about Heloísa's childhood. At some point in her youth, she enrolled in law school and earned her degree as an attorney. Whether she ever practiced law in any meaningful capacity before turning to crime remains unclear. At just 21 years old in 1971, Heloísa's life took a decidedly dark turn, marking the beginning of her criminal path. Her first potential victim was Genter Jorg Wolf, a physician who, at the time, was her lover. The scene unfolded in the city of Taquara, about 70 kilometers, roughly 45 miles from Porto Alegre. Under circumstances the police would later deem highly suspicious, the doctor died in a car accident. This event is considered the first possible crime orchestrated by Heloísa. In a society where traffic accidents, especially on rural roads, were easily accepted as tragic misfortunes, Wolf's death likely didn't raise much immediate suspicion, perhaps only a local murmur of pity. But 6 months later, Heloísa's mask began to crack, revealing the cold, calculated motive driving her inheritance. With the composure of someone executing a business contract rather than mourning a loved one, Heloísa made her first financial move. She went to a registry office in Porto Alegre to register her daughter, Vittoria, as the legitimate child of the deceased doctor. This act of falsification and fraud was meant to secure the child's, and by extension, her own claim to Wolf's estate. The attempt, however, failed. Dr. Wolf's family challenged the registration, and it was never formalized. This episode not only exposed her clear intent to profit from a partner's death, but also revealed her audacity in openly confronting a family of social standing. The first chapter in Porto Alegre had come to an end, but Heloísa's hunger for wealth and her willingness to remove anyone who stood in her way had already been awakened. Years went by and the setting changed. In Ijotiti, Heloísa was married to Carlos Pinto da Silva, also a lawyer, suggesting she continued to move within the same professional and financial circles she knew so well. The couple was staying at a hotel in the city of Salvador Bahia. Bahia, in Brazil's northeast, stands in vivid tropical contrast to the southern city of Porto Alegre, culturally closer to Africa and known for its sweltering heat and deep colonial history. It was there, in Salvador, that the tension building in Carlos Pinto da Silva's life erupted into violence at the hotel entrance. Carlos was shot 5 times in what was initially described as a robbery. The attack, however, was not fatal. He survived his injuries. But when he awoke from the haze of pain and confusion, the sight that unsettled him most wasn't that of the assailants. It was his wife's reaction. Carlos began accusing Heloísa of orchestrating his attempted murder. What fueled his suspicion was the disturbing fact that throughout the alleged robbery, Heloisa had stood by, showing no sign of panic, shock, or fear. The first chapter in Porto Alegre had come to an end, but Heloisa's hunger for wealth and her willingness to remove anyone who stood in her way had already been awakened. Years went by and the setting changed. In Ijotiti, Heloisa was married to Carlos Pinto da Silva, also a lawyer, suggesting she continued to move within the same professional and financial circles she knew so well. The couple was staying at a hotel in the city of Salvador Bahia. Bahia, in Brazil's northeast, stands in vivid tropical contrast to the southern city of Porto Alegre, culturally closer to Africa and known for its sweltering heat and deep colonial history. It was there, in Salvador, that the tension building in Carlos Pinto da Silva's life erupted into violence at the hotel entrance. Carlos was shot 5 times in what was initially described as a robbery. The attack, however, was not fatal. He survived his injuries. But when he awoke from the haze of pain and confusion, the sight that unsettled him most wasn't that of the assailants. It was his wife's reaction. Carlos began accusing Heloisa of orchestrating his attempted murder. What fueled his suspicion was the disturbing fact that throughout the alleged robbery, Heloisa had stood by, showing no sign of panic, shock, or fear. For a husband who had just been shot, his wife's cold indifference was more chilling than the bullets that pierced him. That moment marked a dramatic turning point. The suspicions surrounding Heloisa were no longer whispers about accidents or attempts at document fraud. They had become formal accusations of attempted murder. The failed attempt on Carlos da Silva's life, combined with the murky circumstances of Wolf's death and the earlier fraud, sparked intense investigations in both Porto Alegre and Bahia. Feeling the net tightening around her, perhaps sensing the cold sweat of impending conviction, Heloisa made a drastic choice. The classic move of a fugitive. She would reinvent herself in a new city. In May 1983, Heloisa Borba Goncalves left southern and northeastern Brazil behind and moved to Rio de Janeiro. The Rio of the 1980s was and still is the face of both glamour and danger in Brazil, a cosmopolitan, chaotic city filled with sharp social contrasts. Moving to Rio was, for Heloisa, like moving from a mid-sized town to Manhattan, a place where she could vanish among the elite and the masses alike. She wasn't looking for a humble, fresh start. She was hunting for wealthier prey and for a judicial and police system complex enough to lose her trail. In Rio de Janeiro, Heloisa started over and quickly found her next target. Iranu Duque Soares was a 41-year-old man living alone in the upscale neighborhood of Ipanema. Ipanema, one of Brazil's most expensive and sought-after areas, is famous for its beach and sophisticated lifestyle, a clear sign that Iranu possessed the kind of wealth Heloisa always pursued. Their marriage didn't last long enough for Iranu to realize the web he was caught in. Just 5 months after the wedding, Iranu Duque Soares was murdered. The modus operandi repeated itself. Now on a grander stage, his death was disguised as another attempted robbery. And once again, the Black Widow was right beside her partner when the violence erupted. And once again, she walked away without a scratch. The repetition of the pattern, the husband shot or killed during an alleged robbery while she emerged unscathed, began to reveal a clear profile of complicity, or worse, orchestration. Iranu's death was swift, brutal, and effective in ensuring that Heloisa continued her social climb through inheritance. With Iranu's estate already under her control or in the process of succession, Heloisa entered a period of intense predatory activity between 1985 and 1990. She went on to marry 3 more men in a blatant act of bigamy, a federal crime in Brazil, comparable to bigamy in the United States. What made these simultaneous marriages truly shocking was that none of the men knew the others even existed. Heloisa was skillfully weaving a web of lies and overlapping relationships, securing multiple access points to different fortunes. During this period, Heloisa also perfected her use of false documentation to secure future assets and perhaps build a facade of a stable family life. In a move both audacious and outrageous, she managed to falsify her son Marcelo's birth records. It's important to note that civil registration in Brazil is a foundational legal document, and tampering with birth certificates is a serious crime that undermines the integrity of identity and inheritance rights. Heloisa not only falsified the record once, but twice within just 2 weeks. July 31, 1990, Marcelo's first birth certificate was issued, listing businessman Nicolau Saad as his father. August 13, 1990, only 13 days later, Heloisa registered Marcelo again, this time naming Colonel Jorge Ribeiro as the father. This cold, calculated use of male identities, reducing them to mere names on a piece of paper to secure future benefits. A chilling level of dehumanization on the part of the lawyer. The Wealth Killings 199-11992 after Iranu's death in 1983. 8 years passed before another of Heloisa's husbands died. This lull may have been the time she needed to carry out her scheme of bigamy and forged records, paving the way for what would become her most productive and brutal phase: serial execution. The next victim was Nicolae Saad, the Syrian businessman who had been listed as Marcelo's father in the first falsified birth certificate. Saad, a 71-year-old man, had been married to Heloisa for about a year and a half. The usual bustle of Christmas and New Year's in Rio de Janeiro gave way to an eerie silence in Saad's apartment. Located in the upscale neighborhood of Ljubljana, other luxury enclave adjacent to Ipanema, known as the most expensive area in South America. On December 29, 1991, Nicolae Saad was found dead. Heloisa's reaction to his death was as shocking as the ones before. When questioned, she gave two completely different versions of her husband's cause of death. He had either been hit by a car or choked on orange juice. The claim of such wildly different causes revealed either a desperate attempt to conceal the truth or an arrogant belief that any absurd explanation would be accepted. What mattered to her, however, was the outcome. Thanks to her position as a wife, Heloisa inherited valuable properties in some of Rio de Janeiro's most prestigious neighborhoods. Nicolae Saad's wealth had slipped into the hands of the Black Widow, confirming the success of her predatory scheme. And just a month and a half after Nicolae Saad's death, Heloisa struck again. The rapid pace of the killings, 2 husbands dead in less than 2 months, suggests that the Black Widow had either grown reckless or was under financial or personal pressure to tidy up her web of bigamy. Her next victim was Army Colonel Jorge Ribeiro, 54 years old, the second man listed as the father of her son, Marcelo. Ribeiro's death bore none of the disguise of a robbery or the ambiguity of an accident. The colonel was brutally murdered in his office in Copacabana, a neighborhood famed for its beach and long associated with Rio's upper middle class. The weapon was something blunt and heavy, an instrument more suited to domestic labor or construction work: a hammer. The image of a decorated army officer savagely bludgeoned to death in his own workplace sent a chilling message. This was no mere fortune hunter. She was a cold-blooded and violent killer. It's remarkable that although Heloisa was later convicted of bigamy and falsifying documents, the formal charge brought by the Rio de Janeiro Public Prosecutor's Office for her involvement in homicide came only in 2004, and, specifically for the murder of Colonel Jorge Ribeiro. The sluggish pace of justice in an era marked by rampant crime and systemic corruption in Brazil allowed Heloisa to continue operating freely, despite the growing trail of bodies left in her wake. The year 1992 seemed to have satisfied Heloisa's thirst for quick inheritances, but her predatory drive didn't stop there. Shortly after disposing of 2 husbands in rapid succession, she seduced a friend of her late husband, Nicolae Saad. The name of this new potential victim was Wagi Elias Murad, also of Lebanese descent. Elias Murad was 84 years old and lived with Heloisa for 8 months. This brief union following a string of partner deaths suggests that Heloisa was already operating with an almost reckless confidence in her own impunity. The last murder attributed to the Black Widow took place in May 1993 in Barra de Tijuca, a newer, more modern neighborhood of Rio known for its upscale condominiums. Elias Murad, 84 at the time, was shot dead. This final murder cemented Heloisa's image as a serial killer driven purely by financial gain. The growing trail of suspicious deaths, frauds, and Heloisa's cold indifference during the so-called robberies created an environment where the truth could no longer be ignored, especially by the victims' families. The death of Elias Murad in 1993 finally tore away the veil of impunity surrounding Heloisa. Eli Murad, the victim's son, was determined not to let his father's death become just another deposit in the Black Widow's bank account. He publicly accused Heloisa of killing his father. To investigate, he hired a private detective, Luis Marques Matea Mota. Eli Murad's pursuit of justice came at a high cost. 5 months after Elias Murad's death, Eli was shot in the back of the head. The attempt failed to kill him, but the attack claimed one fatal victim, the hired detective Luis Marques de Mota, who died during the assault. This event marked Heloisa's official disappearance. The attack on Elie Murad and the death of the detective revealed the extreme danger Heloisa posed and the network of violence she could unleash. Feeling the heat of the investigation, Heloisa simply vanished. By this point, the Black Widow had achieved her material goal. She had amassed an estimated fortune of around 20 million reais, a substantial sum at the time and still significant today, equivalent to millions of US dollars. Since Ijajocent, Heloisa Borba Goncalves has been on the run. The Brazilian police launched a nationwide manhunt, and the lawyer criminal's face was plastered across the country through the disc. Denuncia. The disc. Denuncia is essentially an anonymous tip line set up to receive information on criminals and illegal activities. Initially, the line's coordinator, Zeca Borges, reported that Disc Denuncia offered a modest reward of 2,000 reais, roughly $400 at current conversion, for any lead on the Black Widow. However, the outrage and demand for justice among the victims' families were so strong that they pooled resources to significantly raise the reward. The offered reward increased to 11,000 reais for information leading to her capture. Zeca Borges explained, noting that while rewards typically range from 2,000 to 5,000 reais, they rarely reach 10,000. Cases like Heloisa S., where family members step in to increase the reward, are negotiated and approved by the Secretary of Security, raising the reward to 11,000 reais highlighted. Heloisa's status as a high-profile criminal phantom that needed to be brought into the light. The search for Heloisa is complex, according to Paulo Ricardo Oliveira, Interpol's chief in Rio de Janeiro. She is wanted for a portfolio of serious crimes, 4 murders, 2 attempted murders, bigamy, and fraud. What allowed her to evade capture for decades, over 30 years on the run from Brazilian authorities. A remarkable feat was her ability to stay hidden and, above all, her wealth and prior legal knowledge. Interpol revealed that the difficulty in tracking her lies in Heloisa's use of multiple name variations. She has been operating under at least 8 different identities, altering her surnames. The list of aliases forms a mosaic of her marriages and maiden name, including Heloisa Saad, Heloisa Goncalves Duque Soares Ribeiro, and Heloisa Goncalves Duque Soares. The Interpol chief summarized her prolonged flight succinctly. She has managed to remain at large by using 8 false names, in addition to possessing considerable financial resources and having relatives living abroad. In 2004, 11 years after her disappearance, the public prosecutor's office in Rio de Janeiro formally charged Heloisa with involvement in the death of Colonel Jorge Ribeiro. By that time, she had already been convicted of lesser crimes within her criminal web, receiving a 12-year prison sentence for bigamy, fraud, and falsifying documents. However, this conviction was largely symbolic, as Heloisa was not present to serve the sentence. In February 2011, Heloisa Borba Goncalves' case reached the highest level of international pursuit. She was added to Interpol's list of wanted criminals. This status means she is sought in 188 countries. According to information obtained by Interpol, the strongest lead indicates that Heloisa has been living in the United States since 1994. International authorities are in direct contact with the FBI and other U.S. security agencies, actively investigating her whereabouts. Recent reports confirm that the Black Widow has been tracked in multiple locations across the United States, suggesting she moves frequently to evade capture. She has been spotted in the following states: California, New York, and Virginia. In May 2010, she was reportedly sighted in Florida. These locations, California and New York, hubs of immigrant communities and sophisticated lifestyles, and Florida, known for its large retiree enclaves and subtropical climates, just that Heloisa may be using the vast expanse of the U.S. and her network of contacts to blend in, possibly leveraging her appearance and wealth to live a discreet life. Despite strong evidence of her presence in the United States, the possibility that she might be hiding in Brazil has not been ruled out. Ulysses Serrato, coordinator of the Disc Denuncia's Wanted project, noted that there are suspicions Heloisa could be in the southern states, Rio Grande do Sul, Parana, or in upscale neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro, such as Barra de Tijuca and Jardim Botanico, or in Icaraí, Niterói. This dual trail of leads, one pointing to South America, the other to North America, highlights the challenge of capturing her. Zeca Borges assures that Disc Denuncia maintains direct and constant contact with Interpol, emphasizing that we do nothing without Interpol's knowledge. One of the most fascinating aspects, from a legal standpoint, is the development of the Brazilian judicial process regarding Heloisa. even after decades on the run and likely living abroad. The Brazilian justice system sought ways to convict her, overcoming the obstacle of her absence. Heloísa missed 5 trials at the first jury court of Rio de Janeiro. In the Brazilian legal system, the jury court is reserved for the trial of intentional homicide, similar to a jury trial in the United States. Thanks to Law 11,689, 2008, popularly known as the empty chair law, Heloísa can be convicted even in her absence. This law allows jury proceedings to continue even if the defendant, while at large but duly summoned, fails to appear. Article 457 of the law is explicit. The trial shall not be postponed due to the non-appearance of the free accused, the assistant or the plaintiff's lawyer, who has been duly summoned. The empty chair law ensures that justice cannot be stalled by a fugitive's flight. Brazil's enactment and application of this law in Heloísa's case demonstrates the country's commitment to closing this long and notorious chapter of impunity, even if the Black Widow remains beyond the reach of Brazilian handcuffs. Despite the persistent efforts of international law enforcement, the increased reward and evidence of her presence in North America, the case of Heloísa Borba Goncalves, the Brazilian Black Widow who murdered multiple husbands to inherit their fortunes, remains unresolved, and her ultimate whereabouts, though likely in the U.S., are still officially unknown. The hunt continues, and the woman who turned marriage into a death contract and wealth into the ultimate motive has been on the run for over 3 decades, a wealthy, dangerous ghost in the crosshairs of law enforcement worldwide.